It was a cool autumn evening when Emily Miller, fresh out of college, sat in her small apartment in Asheville, North Carolina. She had spent months preparing for this moment, her first real job in a prestigious company, her life finally beginning to fall into place. She had always been a hardworking, independent young woman, and the opportunity to start anew in a big city was everything she had hoped for. As she glanced through her paperwork, she felt a sense of excitement about her future. The world seemed full of possibilities, but little did she know that her life was about to take a terrifying turn, one that she could never have predicted. It began on one of those ordinary evenings that suddenly becomes anything but ordinary. Emily had just settled into her living room, enjoying the quiet, when the air around her seemed to change. The atmosphere grew heavier, like a storm was brewing just on the horizon. Suddenly, Emily was jolted from her thoughts by an overwhelming sense of dread, an eerie sensation that she couldn't shake off. She stood up, pacing in the room, trying to quell the strange unease that gripped her. But it only intensified, like something or someone was watching her. Her heartbeat quickened, and she gasped for air, struggling to breathe as the pressure around her grew. Then, without warning, the scream erupted from her throat, raw and unrestrained, echoing through the apartment like a banshee's wail. Her family had always been close-knit, so it didn't take long for her parents to rush over when they heard the commotion. Her father, Robert Miller, barged through the door, eyes wide with concern. "Emily, what's going on?" he shouted, but she could barely respond. Her body trembled violently as her mother, Karen, frantically tried to console her. Emily's screams continued, rising in intensity, and her face contorted in pain. It wasn't just the noise that unsettled her family, it was her eyes. They were wide open, but there was something in them that was not her. Something that didn't belong. Her pupils had become unnaturally large, and her gaze was distant, as though she was looking through them, rather than at them. Suddenly, as if her mind had cracked, she fell into a fit of uncontrollable laughter. It was the kind of laughter that chilled the spine, hollow and distorted, echoing through the room like a deranged cackle. Her parents, desperate to understand what was happening, called 911, but by the time help arrived, Emily had collapsed on the floor, unconscious. Emily woke up hours later in the hospital, still disoriented, her body aching as though she had been through some kind of terrible ordeal. Her parents sat by her side, eyes filled with worry. The doctors had run several tests, but nothing seemed to explain her sudden, violent behavior. After some time, they delivered a diagnosis that didn't make sense to Emily or her family: epilepsy. The doctors prescribed medication to control the seizures, and Emily was sent home, relieved that at least a physical explanation had been found. But the relief didn't last long. In the days that followed, her behavior grew more erratic. The medication seemed to have little effect, and soon she was exhibiting even stranger symptoms. She would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming for no apparent reason, or stare blankly at walls for hours. But it wasn't just her mind that had changed, it was her very soul. Once a devout believer, Emily had always been religious, attending church twice a week. But now, she would refuse to pray, even mocking the idea of faith altogether. Her once peaceful and serene demeanor had shifted, replaced by an unsettling agitation. She began to lash out at her family, telling them that they couldn't help her, that no one could. It was then that Emily's family started to realize that maybe this wasn't a medical issue at all. Maybe, just maybe, something supernatural had taken hold of her. As days passed, Emily's condition worsened. She would often wake up in the middle of the night, screaming at the top of her lungs, her body thrashing uncontrollably. Her parents tried everything they could think of, visiting more doctors, experimenting with different medications, but nothing worked. Desperate, they turned to a local priest, Father Thomas. He was a man known for his deep knowledge of the spiritual realm and his ability to help those suffering from strange phenomena. Father Thomas arrived at Emily's apartment, sensing the same oppressive atmosphere that had taken over the Miller home. He observed her for several hours, then began chanting prayers, hoping to invoke a sense of peace. But Emily was anything but peaceful. As the prayers continued, she began to laugh a strange, maniacal laughter that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Her eyes remained blank, as if her soul had left her body entirely. Then, something horrifying happened. Emily began to speak not in her own voice, but in a deep, guttural tone that sent chills down Father Thomas's spine. "You can't save her," the voice said, mocking him. "She belongs to me now. I will not let her go." Father Thomas was visibly shaken, but didn't back down. He pressed on with his prayers, but Emily's behavior only grew more violent. Her body contorted unnaturally, her head snapping back at an impossible angle, her arms jerking and twitching as though controlled by invisible forces. The priest, realizing that this was beyond the power of simple exorcism, gave the Millers a chilling piece of advice. "You need to take her to Widow's Peak." Widow's Peak was a small, isolated town a few hours from Asheville. The town had a dark reputation, with stories of strange occurrences and paranormal activity dating back centuries. The locals spoke of a mysterious curse that seemed to haunt the land, and it was said that only those who were truly desperate ventured to the town for help. It took Emily's parents 2 days to make the decision to drive to Widow's Peak. They packed Emily into the family car, praying that whatever curse had taken over their daughter could be broken. As they neared the town, Emily began to show signs of resistance. Her screams grew louder, her body thrashing in her seat as though she knew where they were going. She thrashed against the seatbelts, kicking and screaming, the voice inside her body mocking her family. When they arrived at Widow's Peak, the town was eerily quiet. The air felt dense, heavy with the weight of untold secrets. They made their way to the old church at the center of town, where a priest named Father Bennett was said to be the only one who could help with cases like Emily's. Father Bennett was an old man, his face weathered by years of experience. He had seen things in his life that no one else could ever understand, but even he seemed unsettled when he saw Emily. She was no longer the young woman he had heard about. She was a shell. Something else entirely had taken hold of her. Father Bennett led the family to the back of the church, where a large altar stood. It was surrounded by candles, and the smell of incense filled the air. Emily was restrained to a chair, her body convulsing and jerking as Father Bennett began to chant the ancient words of exorcism. For a while, nothing happened, and the family began to feel a glimmer of hope. But then, Emily's body began to twitch violently, and the voice spoke again. "I am the spirit of the lost souls," it hissed. "You cannot banish me. I will not leave her." Father Bennett continued the ritual, but Emily's screams grew louder until the sound of her voice seemed to shake the very foundation of the church. The altar lights flickered, and an unnatural wind howled through the doors. With every word Father Bennett spoke, Emily's body seemed to fight back harder. Her hands gripped the chair with unnatural strength, and her legs jerked violently. It was as though some unseen force was controlling her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. Father Bennett stood his ground, his voice unwavering, until finally the spirit inside Emily let out a guttural scream that sent shivers down their spines. "You cannot save her," it spat. "She is mine." With one final prayer, Father Bennett brought the ritual to its peak. A blinding light filled the room, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the room grew still. Emily slumped in her chair, her body limp and lifeless. The family rushed to her side, unsure if she was alive. But when they touched her, they felt a warmth that hadn't been there before. The family stayed in Widow's Peak for several days, unsure if the curse had truly been lifted. Emily remained unconscious for hours at a time, but when she awoke, she was different. The madness had left her, and the oppressive darkness that had filled her eyes was gone. But there was a sense of unease that lingered, as though something had not fully been put to rest. Back in Asheville, Emily's life began to return to normal. She returned to her job, and though she struggled to remember much of what had happened, she felt a heavy weight lift from her shoulders. But every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of something dark in the corner of her vision, a shadow that moved where it shouldn't, a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. The family never spoke of Widow's Peak again, but Emily knew, deep down, that the curse would always be with her. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, she could still hear the distant echoes of the voice that had once owned her. And though she was free, she would never truly be the same again.